The year is 1581. Inside a Japanese castle, a samurai commander stands before his starving warriors. They haven't eaten in weeks. The smell of death fills the air. Bodies of their fallen brothers lie nearby. And then, the commander gives an order that breaks every rule of humanity. Eat the dead. It's the only way we survive. This isn't a horror story. This isn't a myth or a legend. This is real history. Documented, written in official records witnessed by hundreds of people. Some samurai warriors were actually ordered to eat human flesh. And today, you're going to learn why this happened, who ordered it, and how these warriors justified doing something so unthinkable. By the end of this video, you'll see the samurai in a completely different light, because the truth about these legendary warriors is far darker and more complex than any movie has ever shown you. This is the story they don't teach in history class. This is the real samurai. Before we get into the disturbing details, you need to understand something important. Everything you think you know about samurai is probably wrong. Movies and TV shows have sold us a beautiful lie. They show us samurai as noble warriors who lived by a strict honor code, always loyal, always brave, always choosing death over dishonor. And yes, some of that is true, but it's not the complete picture. The real samurai were soldiers, professional fighters in one of the bloodiest periods in Japanese history. From 1467 to 1615, Japan was torn apart by constant war. Historians call this the Sengoku period, which literally means Age of Warring States. Imagine 150 years of non-stop civil war, warlords fighting warlords, clans destroying clans, brother killing brother for power and land. During this time, samurai weren't just elegant swordsmen. They were practical warriors who did whatever it took to survive and win. And winning in the Sengoku period often meant one thing: siege warfare. Here's what you need to know about sieges. In medieval Japan, castles were everything. If you controlled the castle, you controlled the region. So when warlords went to war, they didn't just march armies into open battle. That was expensive and risky. Instead, they surrounded enemy castles and waited, and waited, and waited. These sieges could last for months, sometimes even years. The attacking army would camp outside the castle walls and cut off all supply lines. No food could get in, no water, no reinforcements, nothing. The defenders inside were trapped like rats in a cage. The Japanese even had a specific term for this strategy. They called it kuriyozeme, which means starvation siege, and it was brutally effective. Think about it. Why lose thousands of your soldiers trying to climb castle walls when you can just sit back and let hunger do the work for you? It was cheaper, it was safer, and it was absolutely devastating to the people trapped inside. A castle might have enough food stored for its normal garrison of maybe 2,000 soldiers. But when war broke out, what happened? Thousands of civilians from the surrounding villages would run to the castle for protection. Farmers, women, children, old people. Suddenly, a castle designed to feed 2,000 people now had 4,000 or 5,000 mouths to feed. Do the math. If you have food for 2,000 people for 6 months, but you actually have 5,000 people inside, that food runs out in less than 2 months. And when that food runs out, the real nightmare begins.
First, they'd eat the horses, then the dogs and cats. Then they'd boil leather boots and belts, trying to get any nutrition they could. They'd strip bark from trees. They'd eat grass and rats and insects. And when all of that was gone, When people started dying from starvation, when the bodies started piling up, commanders faced an impossible choice. Surrender and let everyone be killed or enslaved, or find a way to keep their remaining warriors alive long enough for rescue to arrive. And that's when some commanders gave the order that this video is about, the order to eat the dead. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds too extreme to be true, so let me take you to a specific castle, in a specific year, where we have detailed historical records of exactly this happening. Let me tell you about the siege of Tottori Castle in 1581.
By the 4th month, people inside Tottori Castle were eating human flesh. The records describe parents who had to make impossible choices after their children died from starvation. They describe soldiers cutting meat from fallen comrades. They describe the recently dead being treated as provisions, as food supplies, because that was the only way to keep the living alive. One account estimates that over 2,000 people died inside that castle during the siege. Think about that number. Half the population dead, their bodies everywhere, and the survivors trapped with them, slowly starving. Now put yourself in Commander Kikawa Tsunie's position. You're watching your people die every single day. You've sent messenger after messenger begging for help, but no reinforcements are coming. You have 2 choices in front of you. Choice 1, surrender. But surrender means opening the gates to an enemy army. Your warriors will be executed. The civilians will likely be killed or enslaved. Everything you fought for will be destroyed. And you, as the commander, you failed in your duty. That's not just death. That's dishonor for your entire family, for generations. Choice 2, keep fighting. Keep hoping reinforcements will arrive. But to do that, you need living warriors. Dead samurai can't defend walls. Dead samurai can't shoot arrows or swing swords. You need your soldiers alive and strong enough to fight. And there's only one source of nutrition left: the people who are already dead, the ones who died from starvation. Their spirits have already left their bodies according to Buddhist belief. Those bodies are just meat now. And that meat could keep your remaining warriors alive for a few more weeks, maybe long enough for rescue to come. So what do? What would you order? Kikawa Tsunie gave the order, and the historical records tell us it happened. Samurai warriors, legendary figures of honor and discipline, ate human flesh because their commander ordered them to survive at any cost. The siege lasted 200 days, nearly 7 months of hell. In the end, no rescue came. Kikawa Tsunie finally surrendered. He negotiated terms with Hideyoshi, trading his own life and the lives of his top officers for the safety of the surviving civilians and lower-ranking soldiers. After the castle gates opened, Hideyoshi's soldiers walked into a nightmare. Skeletal survivors, mountains of bodies, the smell of death everywhere. The reports say even hardened warriors were horrified by what they saw. And here's the thing, this wasn't even the worst siege of the period, and it definitely wasn't the only time this happened. Let me tell you about another castle, another siege, and another impossible decision. If you think the siege of Tottori Castle was brutal, let me tell you about a siege that lasted even longer and killed even more people, and it was led by the same commander, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. 3 years earlier, in 1578, Hideyoshi surrounded a different castle called Miki Castle. Same strategy, same cruel genius. But this time, the siege didn't last 7 months. It lasted 2 full years. 2 years! Let that sink in for a moment. 730 days of being trapped inside stone walls while an enemy army camps outside, making sure not a single grain of rice gets through. Miki Castle was defended by a lord named Besho Nagaharu. He was respected, brave, and loyal to his allies. When war broke out, he refused to surrender or switch sides. So Hideyoshi's army surrounded him and settled in for the long wait. The Japanese called this siege Miki no Kodio Zeme, which means the starvation of Miki. It became so famous that people used the name for decades afterward. When they wanted to describe a terrible siege, they'd say it was like Mickey. At the start of the siege, Mickey Castle held around 7,500 people, soldiers, civilians, families. When the siege ended 2 years later, fewer than 3,000 walked out alive. More than half the population died inside those walls. Now, we don't have quite as many detailed records from Mickey as we do from Tottori. That's partly because it happened earlier, and partly because the survivors didn't want to talk about what they'd been through. But the records we do have are clear. People starved. And when starvation reaches a certain point, when death is everywhere and the living are desperate, cannibalism happens. Multiple historical chronicles mention that cannibalism occurred during the Siege of Mickey. They don't go into graphic detail, probably because it was too horrible to write about, or maybe because it was so well understood that they didn't need to explain it. But the references are there. The evidence is there. Think about what 2 years of siege means. At Tottori, people lasted 7 months before resorting to eating the dead. At Mickey, they had to survive 3 times longer. The psychological horror of that is almost impossible to imagine. You wake up every day trapped in the same place. You watch people you know waste away and die. You bury them, or try to, until there are too many bodies and nowhere left to bury them. You hope and pray that today will be the day reinforcements arrive. But they never do. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, months turn into a year, and then another year, and still the enemy waits outside.
After 2 years of this nightmare, Lord Besho Nagaharu made a decision. He couldn't break the siege. No help was coming. His people were dying or already dead. So he made a deal with Hideyoshi. He would commit seppuku, ritual suicide, along with his top officers and his family. In exchange, Hideyoshi would spare the remaining survivors and let them leave the castle alive. Besho Nagaharu, his brothers, and his closest samurai all killed themselves, and Hideyoshi kept his word. The survivors were allowed to leave. But here's what I want you to understand. Hideyoshi wasn't some uniquely evil monster. He wasn't doing this because he enjoyed making people suffer. This was military strategy. Cold, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. From a military perspective, starvation sieges made perfect sense. You didn't lose your own soldiers. You didn't waste arrows and gunpowder. You didn't risk a battle you might lose. You just waited. And eventually, the enemy either surrendered or died. Either way, you won. And for the defenders, the commanders who gave orders to eat the dead, they weren't being cruel either. They were trying to keep their warriors alive. Because in their minds, and according to their culture, surrender wasn't an option until every possibility was exhausted. See, this is where we have to talk about why samurai commanders thought this was acceptable. Because to us, in our modern world, the choice seems obvious. Just surrender. Save lives. Nothing is worth this level of suffering. But samurai didn't think like that. They operated under a completely different set of values. And to understand why they ordered their men to eat human flesh, you need to understand the culture that made such an order possible. The samurai followed a code called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Loyalty was everything. Your duty to your lord, to your clan, to your family name, that came before your own life. Death with honor was always better than life with shame. Always. But here's the twist. Here's the paradox that samurai commanders faced. What is more loyal? Dying quickly and letting your lord's castle fall? Or surviving by any means necessary so you can continue to defend your lord's property? If you surrender too easily, you're a coward who didn't fight hard enough. But if you fight to the point where all your soldiers are dead, then you failed in your duty to preserve your lord's military strength. So where's the line?
When does honor demand death? And when does duty demand survival? The commanders at Tottori and Miki decided that duty meant survival. The dead were already gone. Their spirits departed. But the living could still fight. The living could still defend the walls. The living could still hope for reinforcements. And if feeding them the flesh of the already dead kept them alive a few more days or weeks, then that's what had to be done. And there's another layer to this. A cultural and religious framework that made this decision, while still horrifying, at least mentally possible. In Japan at that time, there was actually a history of consuming human flesh for specific purposes. Not common, not widespread, but it existed. And understanding that context helps explain how these siege commanders could even conceive of giving such an order. Let me explain what I mean. Here's something that might shock you. In feudal Japan, consuming human body parts wasn't completely unheard of. It wasn't normal, it wasn't common, but it existed in a specific context. And that context is important for understanding how siege commanders could justify their orders. The Japanese had a practice that historians call medicinal cannibalism. The word for it was hitokui, which literally means person eating. But this wasn't about food. This was about medicine, about curing diseases and gaining strength. During the Edo period, which came right after the Sengoku era, there were people who believed that parts of the human body had powerful healing properties. The liver of an executed criminal, for example, was thought to cure tuberculosis. The gallbladder was believed to give you courage and strength. Human blood was used to treat various diseases. Now, before you freak out, understand this. This wasn't happening on every street corner. This was rare, usually illegal, and deeply controversial even in that time period. But it happened. And more importantly, people knew it happened. It was part of the cultural knowledge. Compare this to Europe at the same time. Europeans were doing the exact same thing. They called it corpse medicine. Rich Europeans paid money for powdered Egyptian mummies, for human skull moss, for all kinds of body parts that they believed had medicinal value. So this wasn't unique to Japan. This was a worldwide pre-modern belief system. The point is, the idea of consuming human flesh wasn't completely outside the realm of imagination for people in feudal Japan. It was taboo, yes. It was extreme, absolutely. But it wasn't so unthinkable that a starving commander couldn't conceive of it as a last resort for survival. That tells us something crucial. It tells us that the practice was well known enough that it didn't require explanation. Readers of that time understood what that meant and what circumstances led to it. It was horrific, but it was part of the reality of siege warfare. So why don't more people know about this? Why isn't this part of the popular samurai story? Because after the Sengoku period ended and Japan unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai class changed. They became bureaucrats and administrators more than warriors, and they built up this elaborate code of honor, this romanticized version of what samurai were supposed to be. Noble, elegant, cultured, following Bushido perfectly. Then, in the late 1800s, after Japan opened to the West, this romanticized image got exported. The West fell in love with the idea of the honorable samurai, and Japan leaned into that image because it made them look sophisticated and powerful. Nobody wanted to talk about the uglier parts, the starvation, the cannibalism, the brutal pragmatism. That didn't fit the story either side wanted to tell. So these histories got buried, not erased completely. Scholars knew, the records still existed, but they weren't part of the popular narrative. They weren't what got taught in schools or shown in movies. Until now. Because you're learning the real history, the complete history, The parts that make us uncomfortable but help us understand what real people in impossible situations were actually capable of. Now I want you to do something. I want you to imagine yourself in this situation. Really imagine it. You're the commander of a castle. Maybe you're 30 years old. You've trained as a warrior your whole life. You've sworn loyalty to your lord, and you take that oath seriously. It's not just words, it's your entire identity, your reason for existing. Then enemy forces surround your castle. You have 1,000 people depending on you, warriors who trust you to lead them, civilians who ran to your castle because they believed you'd protect them, children, elderly people, families. The first week, everyone's spirits are high. You'll be rescued. Your allies will come. You just have to hold out. But the second week comes, and the third, and no rescue arrives. The food supplies are running low faster than you expected because there are so many mouths to feed. By week 6, you've eaten all the animals. Every horse, every dog, every cat, every chicken. You're boiling leather. You're eating grass and tree bark. People are getting weak, really weak. Week 8. The first child dies of starvation. Then an old man. Then a woman. Then more children. Every day, more bodies. The crying and praying echo through the castle courtyards, and you still have no food. Week 10. People are dying every single day now. You've sent messengers begging for help, but no reinforcements are coming. Your warriors, the ones who are supposed to defend the walls, they can barely stand up. They're so weak from hunger they can't draw their bows or lift their swords. And you look at the bodies, dozens of them now, and you realize those bodies contain protein, nutrition, enough to keep your remaining warriors alive for maybe another week or two, long enough that rescue might still come. You have to decide, right now, what do you do? Do you let everyone die slowly while you wait for help that might never come? Do you surrender and let the enemy army execute your warriors and enslave the civilians? Or do you give an order that will haunt you for the rest of your life but might save the people who are still breathing? There's no good choice here. Every option is a nightmare. Every option involves death and suffering. So where does honor lie? Where does duty lie? What's the right decision when all your options are wrong? This is the reality that commanders like Kikawa Tsunieya faced. We can judge them from the comfort of our homes with full stomachs, having never missed a single meal in our lives. But they had to make the decision while watching children starve to death in front of them. And here's the difficult truth that we have to confront. History isn't a simple story of good people and bad people. It's not heroes versus villains. It's human beings in extreme circumstances making impossible choices with incomplete information and cultural values totally different from ours. When we judge historical figures, we have to ask ourselves, are we judging their actions by the standards of their time and circumstances or by our standards? And if we use our modern standards, is that fair? Is that even useful? We live in a world where most of us have never experienced real hunger. We've never been in a war zone. We've never had to choose between two horrific options with lives depending on our decision. We have the luxury of moral clarity because we're never tested. But what if we were? What would you actually do if you were starving? If your children were starving? If people you were responsible for were dying and you had the power to maybe save some of them by crossing the ultimate taboo? Psychology research has shown us something uncomfortable. Under extreme starvation, the human brain changes. Your ability to make rational decisions breaks down. Your moral framework, all the things you believe about right and wrong, those start to collapse. Survival instinct takes over. And survival instinct is older and more powerful than civilization. There are documented cases throughout human history of people resorting to cannibalism under extreme conditions. And not just in medieval Japan. This is a universal human reality.
The siege of Leningrad during the World War II lasted 900 days. Nearly 1 million people died, many from starvation. And yes, there are documented cases of cannibalism. Soviet authorities had to create special police units to deal with it. The siege of Paris in 1590 during the French religious wars. Historical records mention people eating the dead. The Dunner Party in 1846, American pioneers trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during winter. They ate their dead to survive. We know this for certain. The Uruguayan rugby team, whose plane crashed in the Andes Mountains in 1972. They survived for 72 days by eating passengers who died. And when they were rescued, the world initially condemned them. But then people thought about it, really thought about it, and most people concluded they did what they had to do to survive. This isn't about Japanese culture or samurai culture or medieval culture. This is about human nature, about what we're all capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. The samurai who ate human flesh during those sieges weren't different from us. They weren't monsters. They were people. Scared, starving, desperate people who were ordered to survive by any means necessary. And they obeyed because disobeying meant everyone would die for certain. Some of them probably refused. Some probably chose to die rather than cross that line. We don't have records of individual refusals, but it's hard to imagine that everyone complied without struggle. The historical records don't talk about the individual human drama because they were written by people far from the events, people focused on military and political outcomes, not personal moral crises. But we can imagine it. The warrior who's given a piece of flesh and told it's an order. Does he obey? Does he refuse? Does he pretend to eat it but can't actually bring himself to swallow? Does he do it while crying? Does he do it and then spend the rest of his life trying to atone? We know that after these sieges, some survivors became Buddhist monks. Is that a coincidence? Or were they seeking spiritual purification for what they'd been forced to do? The records don't say explicitly, but the pattern is there. We also know that some families who survived these sieges carried shame for generations. Descendants, centuries later, would still speak in whispers about ancestors who were at Totori or Miki, not with pride, with sadness, with the weight of knowing what their ancestors endured. So when we ask the question, why were some samurai ordered to eat human flesh? The answer isn't simple. It's not because they were evil. It's not because their culture was barbaric. It's not because they were different from us in some fundamental way. It's because they were humans in an impossible situation, operating under a cultural framework that valued duty and survival of the group above individual lives, commanded by leaders who believed keeping their warriors alive was more important than maintaining a taboo. It's because war is hell, because sieges are designed to break people, because starvation destroys your humanity piece by piece until you're not making moral choices anymore. You're just trying to live one more day. That's the answer. And it's an answer that should make us deeply uncomfortable, because it means that under the right circumstances, or rather the wrong circumstances, any of us could be capable of the same thing. Now, I know some of you watching this are probably thinking, how do we know this really happened? How can we be sure this isn't just exaggerated stories or propaganda? That's a fair question. And it's a question that historians ask too. So let me show you the evidence.
First, we have primary sources. These are documents written by people who lived during the time these events happened, not stories written centuries later, not legends passed down through families, actual contemporary records. The most important source is called the Shinsho Kokyu. In English, that means the Chronicles of Lord Nobunaga. This was written by a man named Ota Gyuichi, who served under Oda Nobunaga, one of the great warlords trying to unify Japan. Ota Gyuichi had access to military reports, eyewitness accounts, and official records. He wrote about multiple sieges, including Totori, and he mentions the starvation and cannibalism directly. This isn't a random chronicle written by an outsider. This is an official record meant to document history accurately for future generations. If anything, documents like this usually downplay embarrassing or horrific details. They don't exaggerate them. Another major source is the Taikoki, the Chronicles of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's life. There are actually several versions of this document written by different authors at different times, but they all agree on the basic facts of the major sieges. They describe the starvation strategies. They mention the death tolls, and yes, they reference cannibalism. We also have a document called Hosokawa Yusai Oboegaki, which is the memoir of a samurai named Hosokawa Yusai. This is a first-hand account from a warrior who lived through the Sengoku period. He talks about siege warfare and the horrors he witnessed. His writings give us the perspective of someone who was actually there, actually experienced these events. Now here's what's important. These sources weren't written to shock people or to make Japan look bad. They were written for Japanese audiences who understood the context of the time. The mentions of cannibalism are brief, almost matter-of-fact. They don't dwell on the details. They just state what happened and move on. That kind of writing actually makes the sources more credible, not less. Because if someone was making up horror stories to exaggerate, they'd add graphic details. They'd play it up for shock value. But these chronicles don't do that. They mention it the way you might mention that it rained during a battle. Just a fact. A terrible fact, but a fact, nonetheless. Modern historians have studied these events extensively. Scholars like Stephen Turnbull, who's one of the world's leading experts on samurai warfare, has written multiple books that reference these sieges and the cannibalism that occurred. Thomas Conlon, another respected historian of medieval Japan, has researched siege warfare and confirms these accounts. Japanese historians like Owada Tetsuo have also studied the Sengoku period in detail and don't dispute that cannibalism occurred during the worst sieges. It's accepted historical fact in academic circles. It's just not widely known in popular culture. There are also academic papers published in journals like the Journal of Japanese Studies and Monumenta Nipponica that discuss siege warfare and the extreme conditions that led to cannibalism. These are peer-reviewed scholarly works, meaning other experts examined the evidence and confirmed it meets academic standards. And then there's archaeological evidence. Now, this is harder to come by because human remains from specific sieges aren't always preserved or identified. But excavations at sites like Tottori Castle have been conducted, and bone analysis from siege period layers has been performed. Some skeletal remains show cut marks consistent with defleshing, which supports the historical accounts. The archaeological evidence isn't as extensive as we'd like. That's partly because Japan has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, so sites get built over, and partly because archaeological digs are expensive and can't happen everywhere. But what evidence exists doesn't contradict the written records. It supports them. So when you put it all together, multiple primary sources from different authors, modern scholarly research, archaeological findings, all of it points to the same conclusion. This really happened. Samurai really were ordered to eat human flesh during the worst starvation sieges of the Sengoku period. This isn't a myth. This isn't folklore. This isn't anti-samurai propaganda. This is documented, verified history. Uncomfortable history, yes. History that doesn't fit the romantic image of samurai, absolutely, but history nonetheless. And the fact that it's uncomfortable is exactly why it's important to talk about. Because real history, complete history, includes the parts that make us uneasy. It includes the moral complexity and the human suffering and the impossible choices that our ancestors faced. We don't honor the people of the past by pretending they were perfect. We honor them by trying to understand their reality, their struggles, and their humanity, even when that humanity includes actions we find horrifying. The samurai who lived through these sieges were real people. The commanders who gave these orders were real people. The civilians who died of starvation were real people. They deserve to have their full story told, not a sanitized version that makes us comfortable.
And here's the final thing I want you to understand. This wasn't unique to Japan. This same pattern, starvation leading to cannibalism, appears throughout human history across every culture and every continent. Let me show you what I mean. Siege of Leningrad, Russia, 1941. Nazi German forces surround the city. The siege lasts 872 days, almost 2.5 years. Over 1 million civilians die, most from starvation. And Soviet records, which were kept secret for decades, document cases of cannibalism. The government had to create special police units just to deal with it. People were arrested for killing and eating other people. Others were arrested for eating the already dead. Paris, France, 1590. Catholic forces siege the city during the French Wars of Religion. The siege lasts 4 months. Eyewitness accounts describe people so desperate they ate rats, then cats and dogs, then human corpses. A Spanish observer wrote that he saw people digging up graves in cemeteries to eat the dead. The Dunner Party, American West, 1846. A group of pioneers gets trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during winter. Heavy snow, no food, no way out. Of the 87 people in the group, only 48 survived. And we know for certain they survived by eating members of the party who died. They documented it themselves in their journals. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 572, 1972. A plane carrying a rugby team crashes in the Andes Mountains. 72 days in freezing conditions with no food. The survivors, 8 passengers who died in the crash or from injuries afterward. When they were finally rescued and the truth came out, there was international shock. But after people thought about it, most agreed they made the only choice possible. Do you see the pattern here? This isn't a Japanese problem. This isn't a medieval problem. This isn't even a war problem. This is a human problem. When starvation reaches a certain point, when death is certain unless you cross the ultimate taboo, people cross it. Not all people, not easily, but enough people often enough that we have to recognize it as part of human nature under extreme conditions. Scientists who study starvation have documented what happens to the human brain when you haven't eaten for weeks. Your cognitive function declines. Your decision-making ability breaks down. Your personality changes. The part of your brain that handles moral reasoning, that decides right from wrong, that part starts to shut down. Your body goes into pure survival mode, and in survival mode, there's only one rule: stay alive. Every other rule, every moral principle, every social taboo, all of that becomes secondary to the biological imperative to not die. This doesn't make cannibalism right. It doesn't make it acceptable, but it does make it understandable. It makes it a predictable human response to extreme starvation rather than some kind of unique evil. And here's what that means for our understanding of the samurai. It means they weren't monsters. They weren't barbarians. They were people pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. And when pushed that far, they responded the same way humans have always responded throughout history. The difference is the context. In the Leningrad example, individuals made desperate choices in chaos. With the Dunner Party, it was group survival with no command structure. But with the samurai, it was ordered, commanded, part of a military strategy to prolong defense. That's what makes the samurai cases unique. Not that cannibalism happened, but that it was given as an official order by commanders who believed it was their duty. That's the piece that's specifically Japanese, specifically samurai, specifically tied to their culture of loyalty and military discipline. A samurai warrior couldn't just decide on his own to eat the dead. That would be shameful, possibly criminal. But if his commander ordered it as a military necessity, then it became duty, it became obedience, it became part of his service to his lord. That's the cultural framework we talked about earlier. The same framework that allowed samurai to commit ritual suicide when ordered. The same framework that sent them into hopeless battles they knew they'd lose. Obedience to your commander wasn't just expected, it was the core of your identity as a samurai. So when the order came to eat the dead, many obeyed. Not because they wanted to, not because it was easy, but because obedience was so deeply ingrained in their training and their worldview that refusing would have been unthinkable.
I think the right way is to recognize it as deeply human, both the circumstances that led to it and the response to those circumstances. To understand that history is full of moments where good people did terrible things because they were trapped in impossible situations. And maybe most importantly, to recognize that we're not different. We're not more moral or more civilized than the people of the past. We just haven't been tested the way they were. We live in a time of abundance, at least in most of the world. We have systems in place to prevent mass starvation. We have international laws about siege warfare. But strip all that away. Put us in a castle surrounded by enemies with no food for months. Watch our children die of starvation. Give us the choice between eating the dead or watching everyone die. And honestly ask yourself, what would we do? I don't know the answer to that question, and I hope I never have to find out. But history suggests that we'd probably do the same thing humans have always done. We'd survive, by any means necessary. And that's the real lesson here. Not that samurai were monsters or heroes, not that Japanese culture was uniquely brutal or uniquely honorable, but that human beings under extreme pressure are capable of absolutely anything, both incredible nobility and unthinkable horror, often at the same time, often by the same people. The samurai who ate human flesh during those sieges probably also showed incredible courage. They probably cared for wounded comrades. They probably shared their last scraps of food with starving children before things got truly desperate. They probably prayed and wept and tried to maintain their honor in every way they could. And then they did what they were ordered to do. Because in their world, in their minds, duty demanded it. That's the complete picture. That's the real history. Complicated, tragic, human. So let's come back to the question we started with. Why were some samurai ordered to eat human flesh? The answer has 5 parts, and they all matter. First, military necessity. Starvation sieges were a common and effective strategy during Japan's Civil War period. Commanders needed their warriors alive to defend the castle. The dead couldn't fight, but they could feed the living. It was cold, brutal logic, but it was logic. Second, cultural framework. Japan had a limited history of consuming human body parts for medicinal purposes. It was rare and taboo, but it existed in the cultural knowledge. So the idea, while extreme, wasn't completely unimaginable. Third, religious and philosophical beliefs. Buddhism taught that the body was just a temporary vessel, and the spirit had already departed. Shinto emphasized group survival over individual purity. Confucianism focused on duty and practical results. Together, these gave commanders a way to rationalize the order. Fourth, the structure of samurai society. Obedience to your commander wasn't optional. It was the foundation of everything. When an order came, you followed it. That's what it meant to be a samurai. So when the order was given to eat the dead, many obeyed because obedience was more fundamental to their identity than any single taboo. And fifth, human survival instinct. Strip away the culture, the philosophy, the military strategy, and you're left with starving people desperate to live. And history shows us that when humans reach that point, we're capable of crossing any line. Those 5 reasons together explain why it happened, not just once, but multiple times during the Sengoku period. At Tottori, at Miki, at other sieges where the records are less detailed but the references are still there. But here's what we need to remember. Understanding why something happened isn't the same as approving of it. We can understand the logic, the cultural context, the desperate circumstances, and still recognize it as a tragedy, a failure, a moment when civilization broke down and survival instinct took over. The samurai who were ordered to eat human flesh weren't heroes, but they weren't monsters either.
They were men trapped in hell, following orders they probably hated, doing things that probably haunted them for the rest of their lives, all because they believed duty and loyalty demanded it. That's the complete picture. That's the real history. Complicated, tragic, human. So let's come back to the question we started with. Why were some samurai ordered to eat human flesh? The answer has 5 parts, and they all matter. First, military necessity. Starvation sieges were a common and effective strategy during Japan's Civil War period. Commanders needed their warriors alive to defend the castle. The dead couldn't fight, but they could feed the living. It was cold, brutal logic. But it was logic. But the deeper answer, the human answer, is this. It happened because sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible ones, and slightly less terrible ones. And the people who have to make those choices carry the weight of them forever. That's the real story of the samurai, not the movie version, not the romanticized legend. The real, complicated, deeply human warrior class that lived through one of the bloodiest periods in Japanese history and did whatever it took to survive. We don't honor their memory by pretending they were perfect. We honor it by acknowledging the full truth, the nobility and the brutality, the honor and the horror, the code they lived by, and the prices they paid to follow it. And maybe, if we're honest with ourselves, we also acknowledge that we're not so different. We like to think we'd never do what they did. We like to imagine we'd choose death over crossing that ultimate taboo. But we've never been tested. We've never starved for months. We've never watched everyone around us die while we were powerless to help. So instead of judgment, maybe what we owe these historical figures is humility. The humility to recognize that we don't know what we'd do in their situation. The humility to understand that civilization is thinner than we like to believe. That the difference between us and them isn't moral superiority, it's just circumstances. The siege of Tottori Castle ended in 1581, over 400 years ago. Everyone who lived through it, everyone who died in it, everyone who ate human flesh to survive it, they're all gone now. Dust in memory. But their story remains, and it's a story that matters. Not because it's pleasant or inspiring or heroical, but because it's true. Because it shows us what humans are really capable of when pushed to the edge. And because it reminds us that history is never as simple as we want it to be. The samurai who were ordered to eat human flesh in 1581, because war is hell, because sieges are designed to break people, and because commanders believed keeping their warriors alive was worth crossing the ultimate taboo. That's the historical answer. But the deeper answer, the human answer, is this. It happened because sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible ones, and slightly less terrible ones. And the people who have to make those choices carry the weight of them forever. Now you know the truth, the part of samurai history that doesn't make it into the movies, the part that's uncomfortable and disturbing and deeply, tragically human. So I want to ask you something. Leave a comment and tell me honestly, if you were the commander at Tottori Castle, watching your people starve, knowing no rescue was coming, what would you have done? Would you have given the order? Would you have surrendered? Would you have let everyone die while maintaining the taboo? There's no right answer. There probably wasn't a right answer back then either. But thinking about it, really wrestling with that question, that's how we engage with history. Not as a simple story, but as a complex human drama where real people face choices we hope we never have to face. If this video showed you a side of samurai history you'd never seen before, hit that like button. If you want more real history, the uncomfortable truths that don't usually get told, subscribe to this channel. And remember, history isn't about heroes and villains. It's about humans. Flawed, struggling, complicated humans trying to survive in worlds we can barely imagine. Just like the samurai who were ordered to eat human flesh in 1581. Just like all of us would be, if we faced what they faced. Thanks for watching, and thanks for being willing to explore the darker corners of history with me.